Lovely. Thank you, everyone. Nice to be here, and I'm sorry I held you up a little bit. I was actually chasing around some stuff on some foot and mouth disease preparedness this afternoon. So we're a little bit busy in our space at the present moment in time. In the last 12 months, we've had 4 emergency animal disease responses, one of which was Japanese encephalitis, which you've probably heard about at some stage. And what I'm trying to speak to you about this afternoon is management of some of those insect-borne viruses. Flaviviruses are probably the most common of them, but we also get things like Ross River fever that are associated as well. So we need to just be aware of those on the way through. So the 2 most common that we've heard about, or that you'll probably hear about, is one is West Nile virus. It's a mosquito-borne zoonotic disease. In other words, it can affect people as well as affect animals. And it affects birds, horses, and multiple other species. People and horses are what we call an incidental host. It doesn't go any further after it gets to them, but can cause major disease. And in the large outbreak that we had in West Nile virus back in 2011, there was about a 10% death rate in that particular one. So the situation in early this year, it was around early January, we had a spike of cases of what we thought were West Nile virus, and indeed some of them still were. A group of them was around, I'm presuming this is my little arrow, no? Around Scone in the Hunter Valley, so right directly around this area, and another cluster down in Wagga. There are 11 cases overall. Most of them, surprisingly, were in quite young animals. Most of them were in foals under weaning age, so under 6 months of age. There were a couple of outliers that were adults, and they showed peracute neurological signs. So one of them in particular I know was absolutely normal when the paddock was checked at 12. By 3 in the afternoon when they went to do feed up, it was staggering and unable to stand. By an hour later, it was circling, head pressing, and creating all sorts of hyperesthetic issues. So if you were touching it at all, it would just completely go off its chops. So it makes things a little bit difficult to deal with these animals, and that was the cluster that we had to start with. So from a Department of Primary Industry response point of view, it's a zoonosis. Why does it occur? Because there's mosquitoes that are around that are infected. It passes it on to people just as easily as they pass it on to horses. So we do what we call a zoonotic alert. We contact New South Wales Department of Public Health, and they do messaging through local health areas around mosquito control for personnel and people in the region. From a veterinary perspective, we sent out what we call a Chief Veterinary Officer's Bulletin. It went out to the AVA, the Australian Veterinary Association, the Equine Vets Association, and what we call the Veterinary Practitioners Board. So all the vets that you have on board on farm on your studs, including the local crew in here, all received that notification. In fact, several of the cases were hospitalised in this hospital here. We also sent out a whole lot of communications to horse owners via social media, the land, and the ABC radio in order to get people to start doing mosquito protection on their populations of horses that they were around, as well as strong messaging around using mosquito protection yourself. Then in late February, we had a whole lot of pigs. Yeah, nice little gruesome picture, sorry about that one. A whole lot of piggeries across New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria that all started showing increased numbers of fertility issues in their sows. So they had large numbers of mosquitoes that they'd noticed in the area, and this was actually showing up because they were getting carcass damage, so skin damage on animals that had gone through to the abattoirs, and they were having to run effective protection from there. But the piggery issues in the sows, they were getting deformed piglets, poor survival of piglets, shaky piglets, so piglets that were born with neurological signs, weak piglets, stillborn litters, and mummified fetuses. What's that got to do with you guys as horse owners? Well, Japanese encephalitis was the diagnosis that was put forward. And Japanese encephalitis is once again another virus called a flavivirus, spread by mosquitoes. It is a zoonosis. It can affect, most commonly, waterfowl, including herons and those sorts of water birds, through to other water cycle. The amplifying problem or issue with it is that pigs, not only do they get sick with it, but they send out massive amounts of virus that are then picked up by other mosquitoes and taken on to bite people, birds and horses around those regions. Horses and humans, once again, we're what we call a dead-end host. It doesn't go any further, but it can cause major neurological signs in it. There were 8 people that actually died from Japanese encephalitis during the last season, during this outbreak. There were over 30 people across the state that were affected, but there were 8 deaths. Horse-wise, we'll get to a little bit more of that story in a minute. So the response so far, Japanese encephalitis was an emergency animal disease. In other words, it was known to be exotic to Australia. We hadn't had outbreaks before. We had a very small one, northern Queensland, right at the tip of the Gulf of Cape York. However, when we were expecting to get an outbreak at any stage, we always thought it would just be across those northern reaches of Australia, Northern Territory, Northern WA, Northern Queensland, with insects being blown in. What actually happened was that it lit up all of Western New South Wales, Western Queensland and Western Victoria all in one go after our really, really heavy rain season, so clearly associated with a heavy La Nina. The response was it became what we call a communicable disease of national significance. The only other one is COVID. So it was widespread, it was nationally affecting everywhere. We had control orders out, but from a veterinary perspective, we don't have a lot we can do to treat them. We can manage it, but we can't do a great deal other than supportive treatment. From our perspective, the number one thing for controlling these diseases, and it doesn't matter whether it's in pigs or in horses, is mosquito management. It goes not just for these, but for other viruses as well. So it is also what we call a notifiable disease for both pigs and horses. So if it's suspected to be occurring, and we're still getting a lot of exclusion samples coming through from veterinary surgeons with horses that show neurological signs, it's sent through to the EMAI and we get a report at DPI if it's come up positive. It requires us to make a phone call though, which is to the Emergency Animal Disease Hotline that alerts us to those samples coming in and make sure that we follow up on them appropriately. We also, during that time, did some retrospective sampling. So these flaviviruses, so West Nile virus, Japanese encephalitis and Murray Valley encephalitis are all really, really closely related. And they all show up across the board as being a positive. Now, it may not necessarily be Japanese encephalitis, but the test that we're doing for Japanese encephalitis will pick up if it's West Nile or if it's Murray Valley encephalitis. And we have to do a fair bit of testing in between samples, know when they were collected, know when they were showing clinical signs, in order to get a better idea of which one of those 3 that it is. And we may never actually know. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter very much. They're all zoonotic, they can all affect people, they all create the same issues with the horse population, and we need to make sure that we manage them accordingly. So what we did was a whole lot of passive surveillance on what we call retrospective samples. Samples that had been taken in the last 3 months on any horses that had showed nervous signs. So it might have been a little bit ataxic, something like the wobblers that you see occasionally. So just a little bit ataxic behind, not showing normal movement. They might be a little bit off colour, high temperatures, some other neurological signs. They were the sorts of cases that we went back and tested for these viruses. Overall, we ended up with 30 probable cases of Japanese encephalitis during that outbreak in horses. I'm aware of, and I could be wrong because we don't always get the final information, but I'm aware of about 5 of them that were euthanized, and most of those were young horses that were unable to feed because of neurological signs. What happened is that some of those cases that I originally showed you that came up as West Nile virus, because that's what we were testing for at the time, actually are more likely to have been Japanese encephalitis. Because of the way the testing goes and the poor response to testing, or the difficulty with differentiating between them when we're doing testing, we only have probable and possible cases of Japanese encephalitis. We don't have a definitive case. The only way we can do definitives is do what we call a paired sample. We take one when they're acutely sick, and about 2 weeks later we take another sample and check what the rise in titer has been, the rise in antibodies has been over that time period. We unfortunately don't have any of those cases, so we're still looking at just probable and possible. So what's it mean to you guys? What was the impact on the horse industry? Well, there were loss of individual animals. I know of about 5. We also have some that have showed ongoing neurological signs. They haven't completely recovered from the effects of the viruses. More importantly, we had some major issues with export markets at the time. So the OIE recommendations, that's the World Horse Health, like the World Health Organization, it's the Animal Health Organization, and they've just been renamed. I'm sorry, I haven't changed that slide yet. But they have recommendations because they're zoonotic around countries not introducing those viruses. The fact that horses are a dead-end host hasn't been taken into play in that. So it limited our export to countries like New Zealand, United Kingdom, and in particular Macau, from areas that had been nearby, i.e. within 100 kilometres, of an infected premises. So that didn't matter whether it was horse premise or pig premise. If you'd been within 100 kilometres, you couldn't be exported. So you can see that's basically the area that was affected by that 100 kilometre radius. And the Department of Agricultural Fisheries and Forestry in a federal capacity did a heap of work with New Zealand to try and get that lifted, and after about 3 months we managed to get that lifted. So it's now only if it's occurred on a property. But for some time we had to move horses out of that zone to a free area for at least 21 days prior to export. So you had those sorts of things affecting you as an industry in perfectly healthy horses, let alone the effects on individual animals. Secondly, there's the cost of protection and/or prevention. Now, the only way we can actually go about preventing it is vaccinating it. We do vaccinate horses that get exported to some countries internationally. So they're vaccinated just before they go, and there's a very special permit allowed for that vaccination to occur. We have applied for an emergency permit through the APVMA internationally to get Japanese encephalitis vaccine into the country for the purpose of vaccinating high-value horses. So that would be your stallions, your high-value mares, some of the high-value race horses, and on top of that, high-value performance horses. If you look at some of the dressage horses, show-jumping horses, those sorts of ones that are high-level competing, and/or there was one case that was a probable, you may have come across on social media, that was a fairly high-value camp drafting stallion from down south. So there are plenty of horses that would like to look at vaccination. Problem is the market is small, And so the companies that produce the vaccine are taking their time, one could say, in getting the information across to us. The fact that it's in Japan and it all has to be translated into English doesn't make it any easier. So it can be, or it may be, some time before we actually get the possible option of vaccination for Japanese encephalitis. West Nile virus, there is a vaccine that is almost completely registered in Australia except for the packaging. It dropped off in need after the last major El Niño event in 2011. We haven't had another need for vaccine for West Nile virus up until now, the last 6 months or so. So whether there is enough requirement from industry to warrant completing that registration for vaccine may or may not happen. There has been an application put through for 500 doses to come in for high value horses, once again directly to the hunter and mainly looking at high value stallions and broodmares, but that may or may not come about. The last conversation I had was they were still considering bringing it into the country. So where to from here, and why am I telling you guys about all this? It's all very nice and well and good to know that it was going on. What's the important bit for you guys as stud managers, stud workers, to be aware of out of this? Well, problem is it going to be an endemic disease, a disease that just sits in our population of water birds and every now and then recycles out of that to affect horses and or pigs within the background? We don't know. I can't give you that answer. We do know that the previous large La Niña event that we had in 2011 had a major outbreak of West Nile virus. This time it's been an outbreak of West Nile virus and a major outbreak of Japanese encephalitis. It comes in with La Niñas. It probably comes in associated with water bird migrations that come down following the floods that come through Western New South Wales. We don't have enough details about it. If this weather pattern continues, are we going to see it this year? I don't know. Can't give you that information. We presume it's going to continue to circulate and therefore the risk is still present for horses in the area. But more importantly, the risk is present there for you guys as well as workers. It's not just about the horses in this circumstance. It is a zoonotic potential disease. So our major thing, our major educational process is on vector control. These flaviviruses are not the only insect-borne virus that gets spread around horses. Ross River fever is another one. So if we can maintain the insects or vectors around our properties effectively, we can maintain the safety of our horses, but also ourselves. So education on vector control is really important, and I'll go into that a little bit more in a minute. Vaccination, do we still look at vaccinating high value animals? Do we look at only doing it in years that there's La Niña events going on? Do we continue to pursue entry of Japanese encephalitis vaccine into the country? It will probably happen because there's a lot of pressure from the pig industry to get it into the country. They lost about 80% of their production over that 3 months. That was over 3 million pigs. That's a lot of production loss on one industry over a short period of time. So they're putting a lot of pressure on trying to get the vaccine into the country, and if we can piggyback off that for horses, it will be a much easier job. So vaccination is certainly an option. Surveillance, we're doing a whole lot more surveillance, and New South Wales Health do a whole lot of surveillance every year. They have mosquito monitoring stations across the state to look for these sorts of viruses and others from its human health aspect. Interestingly, the West Nile virus cases that we got in those 2 clusters early in the year, They hadn't had anything show up in their mosquitoes, and they used us as the surveillance. They said, yep, clearly it's going around the country. We need to up our messaging now. So it's a little bit give and take on that one. Do we bother going around and testing all horses and going, yep, we've got Japanese encephalitis going around? Like I said, Japanese encephalitis, we need to get a rising titer to show that it's a current infection. If you've had chicken pox, you've probably got a chicken pox titer, but you haven't got a current case of chicken pox. It's the same sort of thing. I can take a blood test on half a dozen horses out there, and they may show up with a Japanese encephalitis or a West Nile virus titer, but they haven't got a current case. And therefore, they're not really that we've got circulating virus and that it's an issue at the present moment in time. So we need to look at other things. One of the things that we do is hook in with the New South Wales Department of Health and look at their mosquito surveillance. They also have surveillance on chickens as well. And whether we do some within piggeries, because you've got young pigs growing through that we can look at that haven't been exposed previously. And if you need to get more information, we can do it through our New South Wales DPI Japanese encephalitis webpage. But what I wanted to really hook in on was the education on vector control. We spent a lot of time during the response putting together a whole lot of mosquito management for horses principles, working in conjunction with Animal Health Australia and Racing Australia and Harness Racing Australia to get material that was specific to horses. We had material put together for pigs. We wanted to get material specific for horses because it's a very different environment that you're working in. So, what's involved in mosquito management for horses? I think of it as three different things. It's an integrated vector management principles, and it's basically three things. There's a lot more on the list that I'll get to in a second, but it's monitor, manage, and respond. So what you're doing is monitoring the environment, looking to see if there's mosquitoes around. And that's not just that you happen to be getting bitten. You need to go looking in much closer areas. We're trying to break their mosquito life cycle somewhere along that line. So you're looking at water on your property and making sure you're not seeing large numbers of mosquito larvae, wrigglers, sitting there. You're making sure, as part of it, if you're seeing increased numbers of those, then you're responding accordingly. You're also managing the environment. So we need standing water for wrigglers. Okay, they lay in standing water. So if you've got things like old tyres sitting around that are getting this deep in water and it's sitting there for days, that's perfect breeding environment for mosquitoes. So we need to remove that. We need to try and make sure there's nowhere that you've got runoff from wash bays that's just sitting as pools of water hanging around the place, that you're getting that sort of environment where mosquitoes can breed up. But where do the adults hang out? The adults hang out in bushes and long grass and some of that lovely greenery that you've got all around you outside of your stables. If you go looking under the leaves, that's where they hang out during the day. So we need to manage that environment as well. Whether that involves making sure we have grass trimmed, bushes closely trimmed and or removed, depends on the environment that you're in. If it's a neatly managed field area, different story, but long grass with weeds all around the place, soft leafed green, is a major problem for them and a good place for adults to hide out. So need to be aware of that as managing the environment. So decreasing the amount of standing water, decreasing the amount of foliage that's around. And the last one is respond. So by respond, I mean if you are seeing increasing numbers of vectors, then you deal with them accordingly. So that may be that you're going to use specific chemical control, and it could be larvicidal treatment. So that's looking at treating standing water areas. It may be treating effluent ponds. I know that's not quite so applicable to you guys in the horse industry, but if you've got runoff areas or standing where wash bays wash down to, that maybe something that you're going to look at larviciding. If you've got dams, you may look at using larvicide on those, and you may look at larvicide on troughs if that's an issue when you notice that you're monitoring those areas. Bearing in mind, there are a range of chemicals available, and I've only got 6 copies, I'm afraid, of the actual thing, but it is available on the Farm Biosecurity website just under mosquito management for horses, and it has all the details of all the chemicals that are registered for use in particular circumstances on both the property and on the animals themselves. So larviciding, adulticiding, so that may be, and I'm hesitant to say it around some of our stable areas and things because the side effects can be worse than the problem. So if you're fogging around some of that garden, grass, that sort of bushy area, that is an option. It's something I would only ever look at doing with professionals going about the process so that they're using the appropriate chemicals in the appropriate place and they're not overdoing it and risking any of your livestock, but it is certainly one of our options. Ongoing monitoring and surveillance, which we've mentioned, and with the case of horses, using repellents of some form or another, and there is a really good list of the repellents in that document that I've mentioned that can be used both as pour-ons on individual animals to have a residual effect and try and keep mosquitoes away, but also that you can use as residuals on rugs. So if you've got horses that you're rugging, you can apply it to the rug and it will have a repellent effect on the mosquitoes from there. You've probably seen on the market that there are plenty of rugs around that say they're impregnated with permethrin or whatever else chemical that they're using as an insecticide. A lot of those aren't registered with the APVMA, so we don't know how effective they are, one, or if there's any side effects. So if you're doing it, I would tend to suggest either checking on the rug that's being marketed that it has an APVMA registration, or going for one of the chemicals and applying it to the rugs yourselves. But certainly they're really good options for trying to keep the mosquitoes at bay. Record keeping as that part of the process is just to make sure you keep track of how often it's been done. Some of these chemicals can enter and this is going to sound terrible to you guys, can enter the meat part of processing, and if any of these livestock, be horses or anything else, end up in the food chain, it can become an issue. I know we don't eat horse meat here, but it does get exported, and that can become an issue for us. So we just need to be aware of chemical use at any stage in any livestock production. So the record keeping, make sure we keep on track what we've used, where we've used, when we've used it. It also means you're not going to end up with toxic levels because you're not overusing it. And that's another important part of that process. So I suppose the message from me is, yep, flaviviruses, major outbreak at the moment. Anytime we get a wet year, be really conscious of it. At the moment, we're in a hiatus. You need to have the insects around for it to spread. So mosquitoes basically die off once you've had a week of 10 degrees or less. So over winter, we don't get it. We don't start to get increasing Aussie numbers again until you have, I think it's about a week, but consistent daytime temperatures over 17 degrees and higher than 10 degrees as your nighttime minimum. So it's going to be probably September, early October before you start seeing increasing numbers of mosquitoes again, and you need to make sure you've got management programs in place beforehand. And just remember, it's all about you guys as well. Okay, you are just as susceptible to Japanese encephalitis and West Nile virus and Murray Valley encephalitis and Ross River fever and Barmah forest virus and all the others as any of these animals that you're dealing with. So do take it seriously from your own perspective as well as from your industry perspective. Any questions? Yep.
I guess it'll be the same for domestic animals as well, like cats and dogs.
Yep, certainly they can be bitten, tend to be an end stage and tend not to show as many clinical symptoms. The other thing I think is their fur coat tends to be quite a bit thicker, so they don't get as easily exposed. But certainly we have had teeters available from domestic animals and alpacas. Yep, that's part of it. So.
If you find a horse that's ataxic and you just run normal blood to check up on it, is it quite easy to look past something like Japanese encephalitis, or would it be quite telltale signs?
You need to request it specifically, so we're looking specifically at that teeter. And I suppose the other message I need to put out there is we've had Hendra in this region as well. So if you've got an acutely neurological horse that's rapidly deteriorating, one of the major ones that you would look at as a differential diagnosis is Hendra. So you don't want to be doing too much that's invasive, and you want to make sure you've got a mask, at least a mask and gloves on, and possibly goggles. The rest of it we can deal with. Hendra is actually really easily killed by soap and water. It's a bit like COVID, it's really easily destroyed. So if you have been handling a horse like that, and the other point is you need quite a big dose of it. But you do need to make sure you've scrubbed off, washed your hands. I know on the studs, most of your horses are vaccinated, but as a precaution, just bear it in mind, because you might be at home looking at one of your horses and not think to make the connection. But yeah, it's asking for a specific test. Anything else?
Is there anything you can put in dams or water troughs or anything to sort of discourage the mosquitoes, but it's not poisonous to the horses?
Yep, there are a range of them. So look it up on the farm bus. It has ones that for livestock drink out of, as well as ones that can be done otherwise. There are some that are safer for areas that have got fish in them, but a lot of them, if you're doing some of the standing water in wash bays and things, you need to make sure that they're held for 7 to 10 days before it enters waterways. So just be conscious of that. The details are all in there though, so well worth following up on as a document.
I was just wondering, with like, say you said pigs and birds, domestic birds, I think we had a question yesterday about chickens in the yard with salmonella.
Yep.
Is there the same kind of risk factor, the same having a chicken around that could pass it on?
Okay, so West Nile virus is water birds like ducks and all that sort of thing. So the wild ducks that you've got on your dams and that sort of stuff, yes, there's a potential risk, but it's not a direct risk. It's got to have a mosquito bite an infected bird, then bite a horse while it's still infective. Okay, so it's because it's the double pathway. For Japanese encephalitis, it's more the wading birds, so herons and storks, that sort of thing.
How long is the mosquito infected from the bite?
I knew someone had asked me that one. I think, from the top of my head, I think it's about 4 to 7 days, but don't quote me on that. It's a reasonable length of time. It actually goes through part of its life cycle within that animal. Mosquitoes, it depends on the time of year. You will have some mosquitoes that overwinter as adults and go into a sort of dormant phase. As a general rule, it's about 3 weeks. Yeah, they can. They can. And you all know what it was like. You'd go out there in the afternoon, sort of late summer, and you'd just be, they were savage.
Big sort of grey ones.
Yeah. They were absolutely savage.
Do you have any further questions for Jane?
Well, thanks for your time, guys.